important, to dig into what happened, but I think it's so important to really understand and contextualize why redlining occurred. And I think in order to do that, we kind of have to go back and understand why we have race. Even before we can deal with why we have racism, we have to understand why we have race. And so in researching these maps, this was the part that I really had trouble explaining for a number of years because I was so focused on this one time period, right? Um, and I really went back to my background in labor studies, and I really went back to the kind of the origins of the country to really explain this. And I read a book by Kenneth Stamp called The Peculiar Institution about slavery, which was a really influential book on Dr. King. And Stamp writes about how in the 17th century in colonial America, the white indentured servants and the black slaves captured from Africa were working alongside each other. And they really didn't seem concerned about their racialized differences. They formed solidarity based on having similar material circumstances. And this was a real problem for the colonial powers at the time because people were running away together. They were forming rebellions, such as Bacon's Rebellion and so on and so forth. And so the colonial powers introduced the notion of race and introduced the notion of whiteness into these spaces. And before that, you didn't really see whiteness mentioned. There was really no concept of whiteness before this time. People in Europe didn't see each other as white. They fought wars for centuries based around religion, based around nation state boundaries, but a French person and an English person had no concept of them being white. There were different racialized identities in Europe that contributed to racial capitalism, but it wasn't black and white at that time. And so the colonial powers introduced the concept of whiteness to the white indentured servants and gave them a material advantage. So they would give them like a gun or maybe a bushel of corn or maybe some land, or they would hire them for like slave patrols or something. And that created what W.E.B. Du Bois called a mental wage, right? It elevated those white servants just a little bit above the black slaves they were working with, and it created this identification with their oppressor, right? And it introduced that, and that disrupted the solidarity that was forming in the colonial period, and that was used as a means of social control. And so in thinking about redlining, I kind of realized that the same thing happened within industrial capitalism. And so at this time in 1919, you had a massive wave of immigrants coming from Europe. You also had a massive wave of Black people fleeing the South, fleeing white terrorism in the South. And a popular journalist at the time referred to these immigrants who were coming from Eastern and Southern Europe as the lower strata of humanity, right? So they were kind of the bottom caste in Europe. And he said they are coming from places impregnated with radicalism, Bolshevism, and anarchy, right? And what was happening is that they were living in dense areas with Black people who were fleeing white terrorism in the South, and they were forming labor unions together, right? And they were going on strike. And so in 1919, you had a huge labor movement. It was so huge, in fact, that 4 million workers went on strike that summer. It was called Red Summer. So that's like 1 out of every 4 workers walked off the job that summer. And as I was reading this history, I realized that in those redlining maps, when they said mixed neighborhoods destabilize markets, this is what they were talking about. They were very concerned about those two groups of people living together in densely packed cities, right? And so Herbert Hoover, once again, in 1917, took over an Own Your Own Home campaign, which was headed by the National Association of Real Estate Boards. It was a private initiative that Hoover adopted in the US Department of Labor. And they adopted this because they said homeowners don't go on strike. Their theory was that if we can lock people into 30-year mortgages, place them in the suburbs, they will be much less likely to go on strike. And so by the end of the 20s, David Montgomery writes, corporate mastery of American life seems secure. Rationalization of business could proceed with government support. And what he meant by that is that there was this sort of corporate takeover of the United States in the 20s, and labor was pretty much crushed. And one of the reasons that happened is because all those immigrant groups that were coming into this country during that time were not considered white at that time, right? Slavic people, Italian people were not considered white. They were assimilated into whiteness through this process of suburbanization and their relationship to property ownership. And so the same communities that were living in dense neighborhoods in 1919. By 1940, are living in the suburbs. They've been assimilated into whiteness. They own property. They're grilling hot dogs and celebrating the 4th of July. And so we created these racialized identities to really crush and disrupt labor solidarity. And so residential segregation was an effort to disrupt that cross-racial solidarity and create this sort of permanent racialized bottom class for wealth extraction. There's a great book about this, about Birmingham, how the industrial powers in Birmingham wanted to keep Black people out of unions so they could keep them in what they called unskilled positions and pay them lower wages. Those lower wages translated directly to higher profits. So when the consultant said that mixed neighborhoods destabilize markets, that's what they meant. If I'm a factory owner and my company and my workers are on strike for 4 months out of the year, that's market destabilization. It did not mean that they were worried about social unrest from these different groups not being able to get along. It was quite the opposite. And so, as filmmaker and rapper and author Boots Riley wrote in a Twitter feed, the real issue here is that you cannot have full employment under capitalism. Capitalism must have a certain percentage of unemployed people to exist. Economists call that surplus population, right? We know that not everyone's going to have a job, and economists refer to those people as surplus population. And we have all sort of social management techniques for managing surplus population. The prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the nonprofit industrial complex are all designed to kind of manage this group of people that we know cannot be employed, and they cannot be employed because we need to keep wages down, right? If the higher employment goes up, the higher wages get. And so when unemployment rates fall past a certain point, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times start to worry because it means that wages go up. We just saw this under COVID. In the first few months of COVID, we had high rates of unemployment, but yet the stock market was booming, right? So there's not really a correlation between what we think of as the economy and people having jobs. And so the conclusion that I reached out of this is that racism really exists to justify capitalism. Capitalism has to have unemployment to keep wages low, and it uses racism to explain poverty and hide those systemic contradictions. And so capitalism produces group differentiated identities to disrupt worker solidarity, and then economic value is derived from those manufactured identities. So we can't be anti-racist and pro-capitalist. Or, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, capitalism produces inequality and racism enshrines it. And so with that context, I want to move into the present and really talk about gentrification and really talk